on Dialogue Weekend. Donald Trump announces move to revoke Hong Kong's special trade status after national security law from China's top legislature. The US will also cut ties with the World Health Organization and suspend entry for some Chinese students and researchers. And this week's newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qingduo. At China's top legislature, the NPC had just approved the draft decision to introduce national security law for Hong Kong to restore peace and stability to the city, and the United States, however, threatens to revoke the special trading status of Hong Kong that was announced in addition to other measures against China and the termination of its relationship with the World Health Organization. This is happening at a time when more than 100,000 Americans have lost their lives to COVID-19, and there is widespread protest and violence in many parts of the U.S. Let's start with Hong Kong to see how far the U.S. will go and what impact there might be on the international financial hub. Joining me via satellite is Dr. Zhao Hai, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Lawrence Ma, barrister and chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Welcome to our show, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Well, the NPC, the National People's Congress, the top legislature of China, has approved a draft decision to introduce national security legislation for Hong Kong. So I'll start with Dr. Zhao. What's the content of the proposed legislation?
Well, the content of the proposed legislation is to recommend that the NPC take over the responsibility of making national security laws, partially related to Hong Kong, because still there's remaining responsibilities for Hong Kong's local legislature to finish the Article 23 to complete the national security law legislation. However, because of the current situation, Hong Kong is no longer able to push through the Article 23 and finish the job of local legislation. Therefore, the National People's Congress taking over responsibility to particularly taking care of national security loopholes in that region. One of the things most important or the key part of the legislation is that to prevent foreign interference, because there are foreign organizations and interference in in Hong Kong's local affairs, and jeopardizing the democracy and freedom within that city, because the continuous riot in the city destabilize the city and making the peace and prosperity in that city and throughout that region is problematic. So I think at this point it's very important to take up this piece of legislation, and it's a critical, important task for the NPC to finish this legislation and to help Hong Kong restore its order and also restore and to safeguard its prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lawrence, you are in Hong Kong,
yes.
So I want to have your reaction, your response. What do you make of this law, and why the law is being, proposed now?
Well, you can see waves and waves of color revolution coming to Hong Kong. You see that the Occupy Central in 2014, and you now see the anti-extradition bill riots in 2019 and continuing and endlessly continuing in Hong Kong, the Black Cat protesters in Hong Kong. Now, all these are funded, supported, coordinated by Western powers and together with Taiwan in order to further their China containment foreign policy. So in order to, because there's a trade war between America and China, because Hong Kong is so free, Hong Kong becomes plays a battlefield for these two, for America to destabilize China. So as a result, there's a loophole, as the commentator previously said, that there's a legal vacuum of lack of national security law in Hong Kong for 23 years to enact our Article 23, and we still do not have any national security law in Hong Kong to punish those people who join force with foreign powers to create or incite riots in Hong Kong. And that's why the National People's Congress has to make a decision now so as to stop any national security problems or potential further chaos in Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm. Well, in a press briefing, President Trump said, China has replaced its promised formula of one country, two systems with one country, one system. I wonder, Jeffrey, because I think the Chinese government, the central government, cares a lot about the prosperity, peace and stability in Hong Kong. After all, Hong Kong is part of China. I think there is obviously good wishes, for the future of Hong Kong. So even with this, a security law, I don't think China is somehow in the mood of breaking, say, one country, two systems, simply making Hong Kong just one of the mainland cities. What's your, take on that?
I think there's obviously a context to this, as was just described, which is the U.S. is really on a campaign right now to so-called contain China, which is a big mistake and adding to international tensions tremendously and hurting everybody, after all, hurting not only China, but hurting the United States, hurting the world economy. And we can see really hurting the ability of getting global cooperation to stop the pandemic disease also. So I think that we need to see this in context. I don't think it's the intention or interest of China to break the basic law of one country and two systems. This was said very explicitly, and I think that that's correct. It's also true that this is in a context where the basic law, Article 23, hasn't been implemented after 23 years of it being in force. And so in the global context, I wish that there would just be a calming down of the U.S. attacks and rhetoric, and through diplomacy, real diplomacy, honest diplomacy, trying to sort out differences, because the idea of trying to create some kind of new tension and new Cold War, which I think the U.S. government under Trump is trying to do, is very, very dangerous and destructive.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Zhao, there's, in a sense, I think, understandable concern. People say, oh, this is about the national security, the new law. So, it might somehow affect my freedom or my life in Hong Kong. So, in addition to this concern about, one country, two systems, people are also asking, will the autonomy of Hong Kong special administrative region, Hong Kong's status over there, be somehow affected under the legislation?
No, I think one country, two system is a complete part, it's a whole. So one country cannot leave without two systems, so that, to maintain high autonomous status for Hong Kong. At the same time, two system does not deny one country. The sovereignty of China over Hong Kong is absolute. So I think in this sense, it's very important to have this national security law. It's actually safeguarding one country system instead of what the West has been suggested is destroying one country system. At this point, I mean, anybody looking at the pictures coming out of Hong Kong, the chaos, the sometimes close to terrorist activities on the street of Hong Kong, is not actually to anybody's interest, and it's destroying the two systems instead of safeguarding the two systems. So at this point, to emphasize one country and to have this legislation pass the NPC and maintaining the stability in Hong Kong is critically important for the next coming decades of one country two systems. That's one thing. And the second thing I want to emphasize, that without this law, because of this loophole and this opening, this vacuum area, there is a constant and increasing connection between local organizations, secessionist, seditionist organizations, with the outside forces, and that is making the region much more destabilized, rather than and increasingly unstable for the city to conduct its usual business, and affecting the city's status as a financial hub and also a trading post in the West Pacific. So I think at this critical moment, back to your question about timing, it is really time to have this law passed and there's no more time to waste here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lawrence, President Trump announced that the U.S.
Yes.
will cancel the special treatment to Hong Kong in response to this national security law for Hong Kong. So what do you make of his announcement? You know, how, in what way, and how it will impact about Hong Kong's future, or Hong Kong's status as an international hub, financial hub?
Well, back in 1992, the United States has enacted a law which is called the Hong Kong Policy Act. The Hong Kong Policy Act confers Hong Kong a special trade status. For example, it gives Hong Kong import quotas. It recognizes the certificate of origins issued by Hong Kong for the products it made in Hong Kong. Now, that was very good. But that would be very important for Hong Kong back in the 1980s, when Hong Kong was still a manufacturing city. But as China opens up its door, many of the manufacturings in Hong Kong has moved to China, the mainland China. And as a result, Hong Kong is no longer a manufacturing city, but has been sustaining its GDP growth by providing professional service, by providing financial services. So if the United States is to cancel the import quotas for Hong Kong and to de-recognize any certificate of origins issued by Hong Kong, it would done Hong Kong no harm, because Hong Kong is no longer a manufacturing city.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on and shift our attention a little bit, with the latest measures, not only against Hong Kong, but also measures and policies that Trump threatens to take also against China in general. For example, in the press briefing, Trump announced that the U.S. will be terminating its relationship with the WHO. So, Jeffrey, are you surprised at his announcement?
It's disgusting. I am not surprised by much that Trump does. It obviously makes no sense at all in the middle of the worst health crisis in a century for the United States to cancel funding first for the World Health Organization, and then to actually say it's ending its place in WHO. It's absolutely disgusting. It will harm the whole world. It will harm the United States. It will make everybody's health security worse. It's a kind of irresponsibility that I've never seen by an American leader before, but Trump is very unusual. He is so irresponsible that you can never really be surprised by his next move of irresponsibility. But it's also completely irrational. What does this have to do with the China issue? His claim that WHO is controlled by China is itself such a ludicrous, obvious, stupid, false claim that the whole point of somehow leaving WHO because of China is itself completely irrational.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said, this is at an emergency time. The world is struggling with the COVID-19. But even for the U.S., U.S. is actually the country that suffered the most from the pandemic, with the loss of, as we said, 100,000 lives and also 1.7 million COVID-19 cases. So I wonder, inside the U.S., what's the public response to the Trump government's handling or mishandling of this crisis? Jeffrey.
Well, the first point is that the United States does not have this epidemic under control. Unlike China, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, many, many countries in your region, including China, the United States has not stopped the epidemic. This is because of the complete lack of a national strategy. It's shocking. Here we are in the United States, and our government is incoherent, incompetent, incapable of having a basic strategy to end the epidemic. And in this sense, of course, there's a great concern. But what is very odd in our politics is that Trump keeps his base of support, which is around 40%, and most of the country doesn't like him or approve of his handling. But politics is a little bit strange. We're suffering so obviously, so many people dying, and yet the country is deeply divided when the question comes to Trump.
Right. You know, in his 10-minute address, Trump took no responsibility of the death of the Americans to COVID-19. Instead, he's saying that China has instigated a global pandemic. It seems to me, Zhao Hai, after blaming the WHO, he blames China, without actually a single shred of evidence. So it seems that somehow all he cares, is really about the upcoming re-election in November. Is that the case?
I think there are two things. Number one, the quitting of WHO is actually following the very concept of America first, because the whole strategy of the Trump administration is attacking Democrats, attacking the old way of governing the U.S. and playing an active part of global governance in the world, and also attacking the so-called administrative state, therefore weakening the American government's ability to respond to COVID-19. And in that case, because they have such a bad response to this COVID-19 pandemic, they need to find a scapegoat to blame, and now they're shifting blame towards China. That's very much a campaign strategy to not only link Democrats with China, not only attacking China, but also attacking anything that China touches or linked with, like WHO, that has nothing to do with China's control or influence, only because WHO followed the actually played by the book, follow strictly how to deal with this kind of outbreak. And because the U.S. is dissatisfied with the information they're getting and actually discarded or disregard of the useful information that they should take. And now look at what happened. So in the future, I think if this pandemic continues to worsen in the U.S., the Trump administration will much more likely to, again, using more and more different cases, using China as a shield for their defeat or for their failure in dealing with this pandemic. I would add one thing, that not only Trump himself, but I think a number of people in his administration should be really responsible for this failure of American responsibility. One is, of course, is the Secretary of State Pompeo, and the other one is Navarro, who's supposed to be in control of the so-called Defense Production Act and beef up domestic production. Both of them failed because they don't want to cooperate with the world, not only China, but also many other countries, to coordinate and cooperate and find out the best solutions, the best guidelines for American society. So I think totally this administration messed up with their response to this real threatening pandemic.
Well, in addition to the WHO criticism from Trump, he also announced that the U.S. will suspend the visas of thousands of Chinese graduate students. He says they are, suspected of conducting research on behalf of their government. Jeffrey, how will that affect the China-U.S. relationship? It's really people-to-people bond now being somehow being detached or being broken here.
Well, it's very sad because we like our Chinese students. We like all of the connections, the increases of scientific knowledge, the increases of human connection. This is one of the strongest parts of our world, is that young people can travel from China to the U.S. or from the U.S. to China to learn from each other, to work together, to build a future together. And our university system, which I'm proud to be part of, is a wonderful system in inviting students from all over the world. But Trump is leading a very dark and nasty period of extreme nationalism. And so the anti-China attack is part of it, but it's really closing America's minds and institutions to the rest of the world. It's very dangerous. It's very ugly. And again, it's lashing out by a president who is unfortunately, an extremely ignorant and nasty person, but surrounded by this kind of hot nationalism, which does not serve the human need in an interconnected 21st century, and certainly doesn't serve America's interests at all. So, of course, I'm very concerned about this, and I hope and expect that universities around the United States will raise their voice against this kind of abuse by the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you listen to the Chinese side, they just finished the 2 sessions. For example, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang speaking at the press conference, he said he's been basically calling for more cooperation between China and the United States. Decoupling is not in the interest of any country here. But if you read the U.S. headline news, for example, like FBI Director Christopher Wray saying, quote here, the whole Chinese society is a threat. Pompeo saying Chinese students shouldn't be in our schools spying. Senator Rick Scott claiming that, quote again, every Chinese citizen is a communist spy. So they give you the sense of somehow the return of McCarthyism, or even reminds you of Hitler's Germany, Jeffrey. As a Chinese, I feel very, disturbed about that. So what's your, like people like you, are you, shocked to see, I would wonder what's going on in the States now?
What I would really, really strongly suggest for China and for the world is first to understand how extreme this Trump as a president and his administration is. It's very dangerous and very hostile to the world. But second, I think it's extremely important for China to be reaching out cooperatively to every other country and not be focused so much on the U.S. Of course, the U.S. is strong, powerful, making threats, making accusations. But for China, what is very important and what for the world is very important is cooperative relations with the neighbors in the Asia-Pacific, with the European Union, with Africa, and not really to be obsessed with the U.S. The U.S. is trying to create conflict. It's trying to create a new Cold War. It's trying to provoke China in a way that China responds, and then the U.S. says, you see how dangerous to try to make a U.S.-led alliance against China. I hope China remains calm, patient, very cooperative with all the other countries, and I hope that the United States stops this kind of deliberate provocation of China, obviously making claims and telling lies that are meant to provoke. So it's a kind of bait. And China, I hope, doesn't focus so much on this bilateral provocation, but increases its efforts to cooperate in the neighborhood with Japan, Korea, Australia, other countries in the neighborhood, and with the European Union and with Africa, because that's the kind of global cooperation that we need. Whether or not the United States is part of it, we need strong global cooperation. And if the U.S. steps aside, well, the rest of the world, which is still 96% of the world population, can cooperate effectively, and that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for this nice advice. Well, Zhao Hai, if you take a look at the situation in the U.S., Trump made extra efforts to target China, but what he also failed to mention is the widespread anger and protest in the States, actually, because of the death of George Floyd. So now people wonder, with the situation getting worse, for example, because of the economy, etc., social problems, so is there a possibility, somehow with more problems at his hands, he will get more harsh in terms of his China policy?
Yes, I think there's a possibility to that. But first, I want to address racism in the United States, because it has been institutionalized for many years, and ever since the civil rights movement, there's no disappearance of racism. Actually, under Trump administration, there's a creeping comeback of and rising of racism in the United society. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic increased the level of violence after this George Floyd incident. But if you look back, not far, just a couple of years back, there are cases in 2015, 14, during the Obama administration, back to the Bush administration. There were so many cases in which black men were abused and killed, and society responded with violent reaction, protests, but nothing changed. I mean, things continue to be that way. And even if the Trump administration wanted to use this, it's not going to affect China.
Let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Well, Stanley Ho, Macau's gaming tycoon, who died on Tuesday at the age of 98. Tell us, who is Stanley Ho? What kind of legacy he has left?
Well, as you said, people always call the king of gambling and give him the name of a tycoon on the gaming industry in Macau. So I think he is a very successful businessman throughout his life. Since early 1960s, he got a monopoly license in terms of gaming industry in Macau, and since then he has used that wisely, increasing the influence of that industry, and then later on diversified his family business to tourism, to entertainment, to shipping industry, and also other than Hong Kong and Macau, he gradually also grew his business inside China. Other than successful businessman, he's also a philanthropist. He has donated money and also establishing training centers in China and in other parts of the world. He also developed a business outside of China in Portugal and other parts.
I guess probably that's I'm not sure what that's why he has also been called in local press as a patriotic entrepreneur. So why the adjective patriotic here?
Excuse me?
Why he's being described as someone who loves his country very much throughout his life.
Yes, very much. I think he has contributed a lot to the mainland development, economic development, and also he's been a representative of the CPPCC, and since 9th and 11th, 11th CPPCC as a standing member. He has suggested, coming up with all the recommendations to the government how to develop and also help the reunification of Hong Kong and Macau back to the motherland. So I think in many respects, to his core, he's a patriot, and throughout his life, he has contributed to not only Macau, Hong Kong, and throughout China.
Well, what about his legacy? He has been in the business for 50 years. His name is connected with Macau's rise to overtake Las Vegas as the world's gaming capital. So what do you see about his legacy, very briefly?
Well, he left billions of dollars of legacy, and his family now needs to, and he made arrangements. Now he's going to go through a process of inheritance. But most of the important thing is the prosperity of Macau. I think his legacy is that Macau now is a very prosperous and peaceful city, and now we'll have more business moving toward that city because of his contribution.
Thank you. Thank you to all our guests. With that, we are coming to the end of our show. And you can watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can follow me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.